The cobblestones gleam like black mirrors beneath the weight of endless rain, reflecting the amber halos of gas lamps that flicker against the encroaching darkness. Fog rises from the Vltava River, thick and suffocating, curling around the Gothic spires and narrow alleyways like the breath of some ancient, melancholic god. In a cramped apartment overlooking a shadowed courtyard, behind a window that glows like a solitary eye in the face of the sleeping city, a young man sits hunched over his desk. The room is sparse, almost monastic. Wallpaper peels in quiet resignation. A single candle burns low, its flame wavering each time the night wind presses against the ill-fitted frame. Outside, the city dreams fitfully. But inside this sanctuary of insomnia, consciousness burns with an intensity that borders on the sacred. Pages lie, scattered across the wooden surface, covered in meticulous handwriting. Sentences about men transformed into insects, trials without crimes, castles that can never be reached, doors that remain forever closed. You know this room, don't you? Perhaps not its physical dimensions, but its emotional geography. You understand the weight of the night pressing against your chest, the mind that refuses the mercy of silence, the sense that something fundamental about existence is fractured beyond repair. You lie there in your own darkness, separated by a century and continents from that Prague apartment. Yet you inhabit the same essential solitude, the peculiar torture of consciousness that cannot rest, cannot reconcile itself with the absurdity of being alive. Franz Kafka understood your insomnia before you were born. He knew the bureaucracy of anxiety that files endless paperwork in the offices of your mind. The metamorphosis of the self under the weight of invisible judgments. The trial that never ends because the crime is simply being human. Tonight we will walk through his nightmare, not to frighten you further, but to find strange solace in the darkness. For sometimes the only path to peace lies through the full acknowledgement of our deepest fears. Let his words become your lullaby, his darkness your guide toward the blessed oblivion of sleep. There is a peculiar heaviness that settles over consciousness in the hours before dawn, when the world exists in that grey borderland between night and morning, neither fully asleep nor awake. You know this territory intimately, don't you? It is the realm where Franz Kafka spent most of his life, suspended in a kind of existential twilight, carrying the unbearable weight of simply being aware. As you lie there now, feeling that familiar pressure against your chest, that density that has nothing to do with your physical body, you are experiencing what Kafka felt every night in his narrow Prague apartment, where the walls seem to lean inward like disapproving relatives and the gas lamps outside flickered their amber benedictions over empty cobblestone streets. Kafka understood that long before we face any particular problem, the deadline, the relationship, the decision that keeps us awake, we must first face the sheer overwhelming fact of being alive. He carried what he called a tremendous world inside his head, a universe of consciousness that demanded constant attention, constant interpretation, constant judgment. While his family slept the sleep of the untroubled, he remained vigilant at his writing desk, documenting with the precision of a cartographer the unexplored territories of human suffering. He worked by day in an insurance office, processing other people's claims and catastrophes with bureaucratic efficiency, then wrote by night, transforming his personal nightmare into art that would outlive him by a century. You too know this double existence. There is the functioning self who replies to emails, attends meetings, performs competence in a world that demands constant participation. And then there is the other self, the one who lies awake asking fundamental questions that have no satisfactory answers. Why does consciousness feel like such a burden? Why does the simple act of being aware require more energy than you possess? Why does existence feel like an assignment given without instructions? A test whose questions are written in a language you barely understand. This is your modern exhaustion rendered in its purest form. The weight you feel is not simply from today's tasks, but from the relentless demand to optimize, to achieve, to find meaning in the endless scroll of digital obligations. Each notification is a small demand on your attention, as if your consciousness were a resource to be strip-mined by anyone with access to your phone number. The crushing expectation to find passion in your work, purpose in your relationships, gratitude for an existence that often feels more burdensome than blessed. This is the spiritual surcharge that Kafka recognized long before the age of social media and productivity culture. But tonight, something shifts when you acknowledge this truth rather than fighting it. Kafka offers you permission to admit what you have been afraid to say even to yourself. That being human is genuinely difficult. That your weariness is not weakness, but profound recognition of what consciousness costs. Your sleeplessness is not a malfunction to be fixed with pills or affirmations. It is evidence that you are taking existence seriously, that you understand the weight of carrying an entire universe within the fragile vessel of your skull. When you stop pretending that being alive should feel easy, when you cease the exhausting performance of functionality, a strange relief emerges. You are not defective for feeling overwhelmed by the basic mechanics of existence. You are lucid. You see clearly what others choose to ignore, that to be conscious is to be perpetually on trial for the crime of simply being human. So tonight, you have permission to set down this ancient burden. Let the weight of your awareness sink through the mattress, through the floorboards, down into the dark, quiet earth beneath you. Kafka carried this same heaviness through the streets of Prague, and he survived it by acknowledging it fully. You are not alone in this weight. You have never been alone in it. And slowly, as you accept rather than resist, consciousness begins to soften at its edges, dissolving into the blessed darkness that asks nothing of you except to finally, mercifully rest. In the geography of memory, there exists a dinner table that casts shadows across entire lifetimes. Picture it now through the amber glow of gaslight, the Kafka family gathered in their Prague apartment, silverware clinking against porcelain, the weight of unspoken expectations settling over the meal like dust. At the head of this domestic tribunal sits Hermann Kafka, robust, vital, filling the room with his merchant's confidence and his immigrant's determination. His voice booms across conversations. His physical presence seems to absorb all available oxygen, and at the far end of the table, barely visible in his father's shadow, sits Franz, pale, anxious, already learning the architecture of inadequacy that will shape every story he will ever write. Hermann was everything his son was not. Loud where Franz was quiet, practical where Franz was contemplative, successful in the visible world of commerce while Franz retreated into the invisible realm of literature. Between them stretched an unbridgeable chasm of incomprehension, And from this primal wound, Kafka's entire universe of authority was born. Every court in the trial, every castle official, every faceless bureaucrat who judges without being seen, these are Hermann's literary descendants. The father transformed into system, into law, into the very structure of existence itself. You recognize this shadow, don't you? It may not wear your biological father's face, but you carry its weight nonetheless. Perhaps it speaks with the voice of a critical parent, a demanding teacher, a disappointed mentor, or perhaps it has evolved as shadows do, adapting to your modern life, becoming the boss who questions your productivity, the algorithm that measures your worth in metrics, the internal prosecutor who reviews every social interaction and finds you guilty of being insufficiently confident. Successful or strong? These are not your original thoughts, but inherited judgments, psychological heirlooms passed down through generations of impossible standards. Kafka spent his adult life trying to explain himself to this shadow. He wrote a letter to Hermann, over 40 pages of careful analysis, desperate justification, and plea for understanding. In it, he dissected every moment of shame, every instance of feeling crushed by your mere physical presence. Every way his natural sensitivity had been interpreted as deficiency. He poured his entire being into that document, believing that if he could just articulate the pain clearly enough, the judgment would cease. But here lies both the tragedy and the secret comfort. He never sent it. The letter remained in his drawer, the bridge was never built, the understanding was never reached. And yet Franz survived. He did not become the boisterous merchant his father wanted. He remained the quiet observer who transformed his wound into art that outlasted his father's judgment by a century. This is your permission tonight. You do not have to satisfy the demands of the internal patriarch. You are allowed to be the sensitive one, the one who feels too deeply, who prefers solitude to performance, who finds the world overwhelming rather than energizing. There is profound peace in accepting that you may never win the approval of that internal critic, the voice that demands you be harder, more decisive, less afraid. It has no actual jurisdiction over your sleep. Tonight, let the letter remain unsent. Let the explanation stay unspoken. You do not need to justify your existence to shadows. The dinner table grows quiet, the gaslight dims, and Hermann's voice fades to a whisper, then to silence. You are allowed to rest now, small and soft and safe, beyond the reach of judgment, in the blessed darkness where no authority can follow, where you belong entirely and finally to yourself. Imagine, if you will, a castle built entirely from consciousness, its walls constructed of analysis, its towers rising from years of careful observation, its moat filled with the dark, circling waters of perpetual worry. This is the architecture Franz Kafka inhabited most fully. Not the cramped Prague apartment where his body resided, but the elaborate mental citadel where his spirit both sought refuge and found itself imprisoned. From the outside, he appeared almost translucent, thin, quiet, barely substantial enough to cast a shadow. Yet within the fortress of his mind he was both architect and prisoner, designing ever more complex defenses against a world that felt too sharp, too demanding, too fundamentally hostile to his sensitive nature. Kafka's brilliance became his jailer, In his diaries, we witness a consciousness that could not simply experience, but must dissect every interaction, every glance, every casual conversation into its component parts, searching for hidden meanings, potential humiliations, evidence of his own inadequacy. He approached existence like a chess master, anticipating every possible move, every conceivable disaster, believing that if he could just think thoroughly enough, analyze deeply enough, he might finally achieve safety. His characters inhabit this same mental architecture. Joseph K. in the trial attempts to understand the charges against him through logic and investigation. Yet the more he thinks, the deeper he becomes entangled. The land surveyor K. in the castle strategizes endlessly about reaching the authorities, but his elaborate plans only distance him further from his goal. You recognize this fortress intimately, don't you? You are lying there in the sanctuary of your bedroom, yet your mind paces the ramparts, scanning horizons for threats that exist primarily in your imagination. You are the sentry who refuses to sleep, the guard who believes vigilance is the price of survival. This is the peculiar torture of modern consciousness, the belief that anxiety is preparation, that worry is responsibility, that the endless rehearsal of catastrophe somehow inoculates you against actual pain. You replay today's conversations, dissecting your own performance with forensic precision. You project into tomorrow, constructing elaborate scenarios of failure, believing that if you can just anticipate every possible mistake, you can prevent them all. But notice what happens in these deepest hours. The overthinking that masquerades as problem-solving produces no actual solutions, only more refined versions of the same fears. The mental rehearsals exhaust you before tomorrow has even arrived. The fortress, built to protect you, has become the source of your imprisonment. The hypervigilance that once served as armor now weighs you down like chains. Every corridor of thought leads back to the same central courtyard of anxiety. Every tower window looks inward rather than out toward the world you're supposedly defending against. Kafka's gift was not escaping this mental architecture, but describing it with such precision that others could recognize themselves within its walls and feel less alone in their captivity. He understood that the fortress cannot be conquered through force or demolished through effort. Such attempts only reinforce its foundations. The walls that were meant to keep danger out now keep you trapped within, circling the same thoughts like a prisoner who has memorized every stone of his cell through years of repetition. Tonight, something gentler becomes possible. The drawbridge lowers not through strategic planning, but through surrender. You have permission to dismiss the guards, to let the sentries rest, to allow the rigid architecture of analysis to soften into mist. The fortress will stand empty behind you as you step into the open night, where consciousness finally grows quiet and sleep arrives not as achievement but as blessed relief from the exhausting work of thinking itself. There exists a threshold between sleep and waking, where the familiar architecture of identity begins to dissolve, where the name you carry, the role you perform, the carefully maintained persona you present to the world all feel suddenly foreign, as if they belong to someone you once knew but can no longer quite remember. It is precisely in this liminal space that Franz Kafka invites us to witness the most famous awakening in all of literature. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. Yet tonight, as you hover in your own borderland between consciousness and rest, consider what most readers miss in their horror at the transformation, that the metamorphosis is not the tragedy. The tragedy was everything that came before. Gregor's first thoughts upon discovering his insect body are not philosophical contemplations about identity or existence. They are painfully, recognizably modern. The 5:00 train he must catch, the samples he must deliver, the debt that weighs on his family, the boss who will rage at his absence, even with 6 legs twitching helplessly in the air, even with his voice reduced to unintelligible clicking. His primary terror remains performative. Not what he has become, but his failure to function as expected.
This is where Kafka's nightmare intersects with your own lived reality. You may not wake as a literal insect, but you know the horror of consciousness that immediately calculates obligations, measures inadequacies, and finds you wanting before you have even left your bed. For years before his transformation, Gregor had been nothing more than a machine made of flesh, traveling from city to city, supporting a family that accepted his sacrifice as natural law, carrying the weight of their survival on shoulders that grew more stooped with each passing month.
He was already monstrous in his reduction to pure utility, already alienated from any authentic self, already living the life of an insect disguised in human form. The metamorphosis simply made visible what had long been true. He had ceased to exist as anything other than his function. And here lies the secret that Kafka understood but rarely speaks aloud. Beneath the grotesque surface of Gregor's new form runs a current of profound guilty relief. No more trains. No more clients examining his samples with suspicious eyes. No more humiliating performance of enthusiasm for work that hollows him from within. His body has finally refused what his conscious mind could never bring itself to deny. The transformation grants him permission to opt out of the entire exhausting enterprise of being productively human. This speaks to something deep within your own weary soul, doesn't it? That fantasy of disruption so complete that all previous expectations simply cease to apply. Your social anxiety is its own kind of metamorphosis, the sense that you have become fundamentally other, that if people truly perceived you, they would recoil as if from something monstrous. You hide in your room like Gregor beneath his sofa, believing your authentic self too grotesque for public consumption. Yet perhaps the transformation you fear has already occurred. Perhaps you are already the person you were afraid of becoming, anxious, withdrawn, unable to meet the world's relentless demands, and still, mysteriously, you continue to breathe. What Kafka reveals through Gregor's story is that even stripped of everything external, career, status, the ability to be useful, the essential spark of consciousness remains. Transformed and hidden, Gregor still feels love for his sister, still responds to her violin music with profound emotion, still carries within his carapace the irreducible core of what makes him human. The metamorphosis removes everything superfluous until only the raw, vulnerable truth of existence is left. Tonight, find comfort in this radical reduction. You do not need to be productive to deserve rest. You do not need to maintain the exhausting performance of normalcy to be worthy of sleep. Let your own monstrous self, tired, overwhelmed, transformed by struggle, curl into the darkness beneath the furniture of consciousness. The metamorphosis is complete, and in this completion, finally, there is permission to stop trying to be anything other than what you have become, beautifully, necessarily tired, and deserving of the peace that comes when we cease our struggles and simply rest. There exists a particular species of dread that arrives not with fanfare, but with the quiet, suffocating certainty that you have already been found guilty of something you cannot name. You open your eyes in the pre-dawn darkness and feel it settling over you like judicial robes. The immediate, inexplicable knowledge that you are somehow fundamentally in trouble. This is the atmosphere that Franz Kafka captured with surgical precision in the opening line of the trial. Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. For without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. Yet the true horror lies not in the arrest itself, but in how familiar this sensation feels to your own daily awakening into accusation. Joseph K.'s arrest is peculiar in its gentleness. No handcuffs, no jail cell, no specific charges. He is free to continue his work at the bank, free to return to his boarding house, free to maintain the ordinary rhythms of existence. Yet from that moment forward, everything is contaminated by invisible prosecution. The trial becomes the architecture within which he must now live, conducted in dusty attics and unexpected offices, presided over by judges he can never quite reach. This is your modern condition rendered in allegory. The constant sense of being evaluated by standards you cannot comprehend, judged by tribunals you cannot see, prosecuted for violations of laws that were never clearly written, but somehow, inexplicably, you feel you have broken simply by existing. As you are. The genius of Kafka's vision lies in recognizing that the most merciless court is the one you carry within your own consciousness. You wake each morning to your own internal arrest, that immediate mental inventory of everything you must defend yourself against today. The prosecutor who lives in your head presents evidence with devastating thoroughness. Exhibit A. The conversation where you spoke too much or too little. Exhibit B. The project deadline approaching like a sentencing date. Exhibit C. The social interaction that left you certain you had violated some unspoken protocol. You are simultaneously accused and accuser, defendant and prosecutor, conducting cross-examinations of your own memory with the zeal of someone determined to find you guilty. This internal litigation exhausts you before the day has even begun. Every performance review becomes a trial where you must justify your continued employment. Every social gathering transforms into a courtroom where your worthiness of inclusion hangs in the balance. The algorithms that measure your productivity, the metrics that quantify your success, the invisible scorecards of social media, these are the modern bureaucracy of judgment that Joseph K. would recognize immediately. The trial is everywhere and nowhere, woven into the fabric of contemporary existence like a legal system designed by someone who had never heard of due process. Joseph K. spends his final year frantically seeking the higher courts, the ultimate authority who might finally exonerate him. He exhausts himself consulting lawyers and pleading with officials who look through him with bored indifference. But this is where Kafka's nightmare offers its strange mercy. What if there is no legitimate court? What if the entire apparatus of judgment, the endless self-critique, the comparison, the internal prosecution represents not justice, but absurdity? Tonight, you have the power to do what Joseph K. could not. You can recognize that a court which accuses without evidence deserves no respect. The charges against you, insufficient productivity, inadequate social performance, failure to achieve your potential, these accusations are fabricated by systems obsessed with impossible standards. As you lie here in the darkness, where no tribunal has jurisdiction, visualize the heavy doors of that internal courthouse swinging shut. The proceedings are adjourned. The case against your existence is dismissed not through verdict but through recognition that it should never have been brought. The trial ends, and in its blessed absence, finally there is space for sleep. In the distance, shrouded in perpetual mist and crowned with the authority of the unreachable, there rises a structure that has haunted human consciousness since Franz Kafka first imagined it into existence. The castle looms over its village like a promise written in a language you almost understand, visible from every window yet accessible through no known road. Here arrives Kay, the land surveyor, summoned to perform work that will finally justify his presence in the world, only to discover that every path toward meaning curves mysteriously away from itself, that every official he consults offers contradictory instructions, and that the bureaucracy of purpose multiplies, with each attempt to navigate its labyrinthine corridors. This is not merely literature, but prophecy, a vision of your own modern quest rendered in allegory. You too carry your castle on the horizon of consciousness, that shimmering destination where you believe fulfillment finally resides. Perhaps it wears the mask of career validation, that position or recognition that will prove you were worthy of existence all along. Perhaps it takes the form of romantic completion, the relationship that will heal the loneliness you carry like a second skeleton beneath your skin. Perhaps it manifests as spiritual enlightenment, psychological wholeness, or simply the elusive state of being enough, productive enough, social enough, mentally stable enough to finally rest in your own being without the gnawing certainty of fundamental inadequacy. Yet observe what occurs as you approach these destinations. The promotion you secure reveals itself as merely the anteroom to greater expectations. The therapeutic breakthrough illuminates deeper wounds requiring further excavation. The relationship you enter shows you new dimensions of isolation you had never imagined possible. Each achievement, each milestone, each moment of supposed arrival transforms into simply another village at the base of the castle, which has somehow receded further into the distance while maintaining its maddening visibility on the horizon of your striving. Kafka understood that modernity had transformed the search for meaning into an infinite bureaucracy. Kay spends his days in waiting rooms that generate only more appointments, interpreting messages whose significance shifts depending on which messenger delivers them, completing forms that spawn additional paperwork with the mathematical precision of administrative reproduction. This is your experience with contemporary self-improvement culture, isn't it? The productivity systems that promise efficiency while creating more obligations. The mindfulness apps that add meditation to your list of daily requirements. The self-help literature that explains with devastating clarity why you remain beyond help. Each solution births new problems, each answer reveals deeper questions, each door opens onto corridors that lead everywhere except where you intended to go. When Kay finally reaches any castle official, they prove disappointingly human, petty, confused, concerned primarily with maintaining their small territories of influence within a system whose overall purpose remains forever opaque. They possess no grand wisdom to dispense, no ultimate answers to provide. They are merely people sustaining the performance of knowing their destination while being as fundamentally lost as everyone else, simply better practiced at concealing their bewilderment behind the authority of their positions. But tonight, as consciousness softens at its edges, and the day's striving dissolves into the blessed democracy of exhaustion, consider the radical possibility that Kafka encoded within his unfinished masterpiece. The castle was never meant to be reached. The village where you already stand, This moment, this breath, this tired body seeking rest, is not the waiting room for authentic existence, but existence itself. You have been living entirely in the conditional tense, in the future perfect of when I finally reach. But the castle grants no audiences, because it survives only on your approach, never on your arrival. Let the officials keep their appointments. Let the bureaucracy process its endless paperwork without you. The village is enough. This darkness is enough. You, exactly as you are, have always been enough. In the amber twilight of a travelling circus, beneath canvas that sags with the weight of accumulated rain, and the dreams of 1,000 forgotten towns, there sits a spectacle that defies the very nature of spectacle itself. The cage is small, lined with straw that rustles with each shallow breath, and within it rests a figure whose art consists entirely of negation. While the world beyond the tent flaps celebrates consumption, the strong man devouring his victory, the acrobats feasting on applause, the crowds gorging themselves on wonder, the hunger artist performs the most radical act imaginable: refusal. His emaciated frame speaks a language the audience cannot comprehend. His hollow eyes reflect a truth they are not prepared to witness. For 40 days he fasts, watched by spectators who mistake his spiritual precision for mere discipline, his profound dissatisfaction for admirable self-control. Yet as Franz Kafka whispers across the decades to reach you in your own cage of sleepless contemplation, the hunger artist's final confession reveals the devastating simplicity beneath his performance. I have to fast. I can't help it. Because I couldn't find the food I liked. If I had found it, believe me, I should have made no fuss and stuffed myself like you or anyone else. This admission reverberates through the chambers of your modern soul like a bell tolling for all the spiritual meals you cannot bring yourself to consume. You recognize this hunger intimately, not the simple physical appetite that bread might satisfy, but the deeper, more refined starvation that finds nothing in the world's abundant offerings substantial enough to sustain the essential parts of your being. You have constructed your own invisible cage from the bars of expectation and performance, haven't you? You watch others feast with apparent satisfaction on careers that leave you hollow. Derive nourishment from social interactions that drain you like open wounds. Express enthusiasm for experiences that taste like ashes in your mouth. The world offers its standard menu, the productivity culture that mistakes motion for purpose, the curated relationships that substitute visibility for intimacy, the endless consumption of goods and experiences that promise fulfillment but deliver only the metallic aftertaste of emptiness. Everyone around you seems to devour these offerings with genuine appetite, finding sustenance where you find only sophisticated forms of spiritual junk food. Your depression, your withdrawal, your inability to participate enthusiastically in the great banquet of contemporary existence, perhaps these are not pathologies requiring correction, but evidence of a discriminating palate that refuses to be satisfied with what is fundamentally unsatisfying. Like Kafka's hunger artist, you have examined the available options and found them wanting, not through arrogance, but through the painful clarity that comes from knowing, at some inarticulate depth, that you are starving for authenticity in a world of performance, for depth in a culture of surfaces, for connection that transcends the digital interfaces that have replaced genuine communion. Tonight, there is profound comfort in honoring rather than pathologizing your refusal. You are not obligated to force enthusiasm for what does not nourish your soul. Your selective appetite is not deficiency, but integrity. the part of you that remembers a sustenance you have never tasted but somehow know exists. The hunger artist dies and is replaced by a panther, an animal that eats ferociously without question, embodying the world's ideal of unthinking consumption. But you, lying here in the darkness where no audience demands performance, are allowed to remain the fasting figure, the one who quietly admits that you are still waiting for food worthy of your hunger, and that until it arrives, rest itself becomes the purest nourishment you can receive. In a valley stripped of vegetation by merciless tropical heat, where the air shimmers with the weight of unspoken judgment and the sun bleaches all compassion from the sky, Franz Kafka constructed his most terrifying apparatus, a machine of such intricate cruelty that it transforms punishment into grotesque art. The condemned man lies strapped beneath its needles, unaware of his crime, knowing only that justice will be inscribed directly onto his flesh through 12 methodical hours until understanding arrives through the medium of unbearable pain. The officer tends this mechanism with reverent devotion, explaining its elegant gears and precise script as if describing a cathedral rather than an instrument of torture, declaring with terrifying certainty that guilt is never to be doubted. You recognize this apparatus immediately, because you maintain an identical machine within the chambers of your own consciousness, servicing its gears with obsessive care, keeping its needles sharp through constant use. Every night, as you lie suspended between exhaustion and insomnia, the machinery activates and the inscription begins anew. You are simultaneously the prisoner strapped to its bed, the officer operating its controls, and the horrified observer witnessing the procedure yet unable to intervene. The crimes it carves into your memory are catalogued with devastating thoroughness. The conversation where you spoke awkwardly 15 years ago. The email you sent too quickly. The social interaction where you failed to read invisible cues. The moment when you revealed too much vulnerability and have been prosecuting yourself for it ever since. Modern life has only perfected this torture through technological innovation. Your digital existence creates a permanent penal colony, where nothing is ever truly erased. Screenshots preserve your momentary lapses. Search histories document your secret anxieties. Social media algorithms resurrect your awkward phases with mathematical cruelty. You live in a panopticon where the watcher is your own internalized officer, reviewing the archived footage of your existence for evidence of moral failure. The guilt you carry is often anticipatory, a preemptive punishment for crimes you haven't yet committed but feel certain you are capable of. You apologize before speaking, qualify your opinions before sharing them, perform endless acts of contrition for the simple fact of occupying space in a universe that demands perfection from fundamentally imperfect beings. Kafka understood that for the anxious soul, the actual transgression becomes irrelevant. The punishment precedes the crime because guilt is not a response to wrongdoing, but the foundational emotion of modern consciousness itself. The machine hums its low mechanical song as you attempt sleep, turning the gears of what if and if only, inscribing the same sentence over and over in increasingly elaborate script. You are not enough. You have never been enough. You will never be enough. But observe how Kafka concludes his nightmare. The machine, worshipped for its brutal efficiency, ultimately malfunctions and destroys itself. Its gears grind against one another, its needles stab rather than write, until the entire apparatus collapses in a chaotic spasm of metal and mechanical failure. The officer, who believed so fervently in the righteousness of punishment, is killed by his own beloved machinery, denied the enlightenment he promised others. Tonight, you need not destroy your internal machine through force, simply step aside as it dismantles itself. Watch rust spread across its gears, see the needles dull and retract, observe the script of your guilt becoming illegible through sheer mechanical exhaustion. The apparatus has served no redemptive purpose, granted no genuine understanding, produced nothing but fatigue dressed in the costume of justice. You have served enough time in this colony of self-reproach. The machinery falls silent, its authority dissolved, leaving only the blessed quiet where sleep finally becomes possible. Deep beneath the surface of the world, where darkness presses against silence with the weight of accumulated centuries and roots whisper secrets only soil understands. Franz Kafka imagined a creature who has accomplished what you have spent years attempting in your own way. The construction of perfect safety. The burrow winds through earth in elaborate spirals, tunnels branching into subtunnels, chambers connected by passages that can be sealed instantly. Food stores distributed so strategically that no single catastrophe could eliminate all resources. At its heart lies the castle keep, where the creature finally allows itself the illusion of rest, yet even here, in the deepest sanctuary of its own design, sleep remains impossible. Every whisper of settling earth becomes evidence of invasion. Every distant vibration a herald of the catastrophe that would render all this meticulous labor meaningless. You recognize this architecture with the intimacy of shared obsession, because you have constructed its psychological equivalent within the chambers of your own consciousness. Your burrow is built not from soil, but from routines, precautions, and the invisible rules that govern your increasingly smaller world. You check your phone one final time before attempting sleep, scanning for unresolved messages that might ambush your morning peace. You rehearse tomorrow's conversations, mapping every potential response, digging escape routes for social interactions that might collapse under the weight of unpredictability. Your digital presence becomes a burrow within a burrow, notifications disabled, privacy settings adjusted with the precision of someone designing defensive architecture against the constant intrusion of other people's expectations and judgments. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the perimeter of your actual life contracts as these protective systems expand. You decline invitations not from dislike, but because variables feel dangerous, too exposed to the possibility of social failure. You curate your online presence like someone arranging furniture to block entry points, revealing only what feels safe while hiding everything authentic in the deepest, most inaccessible chambers of your psyche. The modern world has perfected this compulsion toward fortification. We build fortresses of information, believing that if we just research enough symptoms, understand enough risks, anticipate enough scenarios, we can finally inoculate ourselves against uncertainty's intrusion. Yet observe the paradox that Kafka illuminates with such devastating clarity. The burrow itself generates the very dangers it seeks to prevent. The creature's hypervigilance creates the threats it anticipates. its elaborate defenses becoming a prison more restrictive than any external enemy could impose. You lie awake, calculating risks that exist primarily in imagination. Your safety-seeking behaviors producing the isolation they were designed to prevent. The sanctuary transforms into a tomb of your own meticulous construction, where vigilance demands eternal wakefulness and silence itself becomes suspicious evidence of approaching catastrophe. Tonight, in the physical safety of your bedroom, which is, in its own way, the center of your burrow, allow yourself to recognize the profound exhaustion of this constant maintenance. The enemy you fear is not tunneling toward you from outside. The sound you hear is your own anxious heart echoing against walls of solitude. Visualize the elaborate tunnels of worry gradually filling with soft earth, the chambers of contingency plans gently collapsing, the entire system of psychological defense returning to the ground from which it was excavated. You have dug deep enough. The fortress holds, and its completion means you can finally stop building, stop reinforcing, stop listening for threats that dissolve when consciousness releases its grip on control. Let yourself sink into this natural burrow of sleep, where safety arrives not through construction but through the radical act of surrender. In the November darkness of 1919, beneath the wavering glow of gaslight that transforms shadows into living things against the peeling wallpaper, Franz Kafka bends over his writing desk with the intensity of a surgeon performing the most delicate operation imaginable. The attempted resurrection of understanding between father and son. His pen moves across page after page with meticulous precision, each sentence carved from the accumulated silence of 36 years. The letter grows beneath his hand like an architectural marvel of articulated pain. 100 pages of explanation, justification, and desperate plea for comprehension. "Dearest father," it begins, "you asked me recently why I maintain that I am afraid of you. And from that opening flows a torrent of vulnerability so pure it seems to illuminate the cramped room with its own phosphorescent glow. Yet here lies the detail that transforms this biographical curiosity into a mirror reflecting your own sleepless struggles. When Franz finally entrusted the massive document to his mother for delivery, she read it and quietly returned it to her son, understanding what he could not yet accept that some bridges cannot be built across certain chasms, no matter how exquisite the engineering of language. The letter was never sent. The explanation never arrived. The understanding was never achieved. And in this non-delivery rests a truth that speaks directly to the archive of unspoken words you carry like stones in your chest. You recognize this weight intimately because you maintain your own collection of phantom communications, don't you? They exist in the drafts folder of your email like digital tombs, in text messages composed and deleted with the frantic urgency of someone trying to defuse a bomb made of misunderstanding. The modern world has perfected this torture through technological innovation. You can now revise infinitely, watching your thoughts materialize and vanish with algorithmic precision. Hours dissolve as you craft the perfect explanation for your anxiety. The ideal articulation of why you withdrew when you most wanted to connect. The flawless defense of your sensitivity in a world that mistakes vulnerability for weakness. The cursor blinks with the rhythm of your anxious heart as you add nuance, remove exposure, search for that impossible combination of honesty and safety. Perhaps there exists in your mental archives a letter to the parent who never understood why you needed so much solitude, an explanation to the former lover about the particular geography of your depression, a confession to friends about the loneliness you feel even in their presence. These communications pulse with the urgency of the unexpressed, yet something stops you. The exhausting certainty that your carefully chosen words will be filtered through the same incomprehension that created the need for explanation in the first place. Like Kafka, you believe that if you could just find the right sentences, if you could just explain your internal weather system with enough meteorological precision, the other person would finally see the landscape of your soul clearly. But tonight, Kafka's failure offers you the strangest and most beautiful permission. The letter served its purpose not by being read, but by being written. The act of articulation was for Franz, not Hermann. Some gaps represent not failures of communication, but ontological facts. Differences so fundamental that no quantity of eloquent explanation could bridge them. You are released from the exhausting obligation to make yourself understood by people structurally incapable of comprehension. Absolved from justifying your existence to judges who were never qualified to hear your case. Let the drafts rest in their folders like pressed flowers between the pages of a book no one else will read. Let the rehearsed conversations fade into the blessed silence where sleep finally becomes possible. Your truth exists without external validation. Your experience remains valid, whether witnessed or not. And you can rest tonight knowing that some letters achieve their deepest purpose by remaining forever mercifully beautifully unsent. There exists a peculiar species of loneliness that flourishes most abundantly not in solitude, but in the agonizing proximity of other people. As if you were perpetually pressed against an invisible pane of glass, watching life unfold on the other side, while remaining forever separated by barriers you can neither see nor breach. Franz Kafka inhabited this paradox as if it were his permanent address, conducting his most passionate relationships through the safe mediation of ink and paper, where vulnerability could be measured in controlled doses and the terrifying immediacy of physical presence kept at bay by the reliable distance of Central European postal routes. His courtship with Felice Bauer filled volumes, hundreds of pages documenting a love affair conducted almost entirely through letters, where he could be eloquent, tender, almost brave. Yet when the moment arrived to transform epistolary romance into embodied commitment, he discovered within himself a terror more profound than any he had yet documented in his fiction. You recognize this oscillation intimately because it forms the central rhythm of your own social existence. The desperate hunger for connection warring with the equally desperate need to escape before authentic revelation can occur. Twice Kafka became engaged, twice he retreated, finally watching as Felice married someone else and stepped into the ordinary, solid life he felt structurally incapable of inhabiting. This was not mere romantic ambivalence, but the recognition that if another person truly perceived the interior landscape of your consciousness, with all its anxious topography, its valleys of inadequacy, its mountains of overthought, they would recoil as if from something fundamentally unlovable. Modern technology has industrialized this impossibility into a systematic torture. Dating applications promise infinite connection while delivering only the exhausting performance of curated selfhood, where you present carefully edited manuscripts of your personality rather than the messy, unedited original. You swipe through faces like a curator browsing human possibility, yet each potential match feels less like a person and more like a threat to your carefully maintained equilibrium. Social media offers fragments of intimacy, glimpses, captions, performances, while your soul starves amidst this abundance of surface contact. You prefer text messages that allow personality editing, emails that let you curate vulnerability, online interactions where you can be bold precisely because you remain physically absent. Yet tonight, consider Kafka's profound gift. His inability to connect was not failure, but a form of radical honesty. He recognized the unbridgeable distance between any two consciousnesses, the gap that no amount of love or language can fully close. And rather than pretending otherwise, he stood at the edge and acknowledged the abyss. Most people spend their lives filling this fundamental separation with noise and activity. Kafka simply admitted what you have always sensed, that perfect understanding remains forever impossible, that some degree of isolation is the irreducible condition of consciousness itself. There is strange peace in accepting this impossibility rather than exhausting yourself fighting it. You are not broken because you feel alone even in company. You are perceptive. And paradoxically, in acknowledging this essential solitude, you join a vast, invisible community of souls who feel exactly the same way, connected to Kafka across a century. To the millions lying awake, wrestling with identical contradictions, united in your shared experience of beautiful, necessary separation, rest now in your own wholeness, complete even in incompleteness. In the grey institutional corridors of the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, where human catastrophe is transformed daily into actuarial tables and claim numbers, Franz Kafka discovered the terrible truth that would haunt his fiction for decades. Suffering itself operates according to bureaucratic principles, complete with filing systems, procedural requirements, and administrative hierarchies that process the most intimate anguish through mechanisms designed to reduce the irreducible complexity of human pain into manageable paperwork. By day, he evaluated workplace injuries with the mechanical precision required by institutional efficiency. A severed finger becomes Form 27B. A widow's grief translates into compensation calculations. A shattered spine transforms into statistical data points that will inform next quarter's risk. Assessments. By night, he channeled this revelation into the dusty attics and endless corridors of the trial, where Joseph K. discovers that his prosecution is handled by minor officials who shuffle papers with the weary competence of clerks who have forgotten what justice means but remember perfectly how to maintain its administrative appearance. You inhabit this same machinery now, though its gears have evolved and multiplied, becoming invisible threads woven into the fabric of contemporary existence. When your mind fractures under accumulated pressure, you encounter not a single compassionate healer, but a sequence of systems, online intake forms that reduce your despair to drop-down menus, diagnostic questionnaires that translate your unique suffering into standardized categories, insurance, protocols that determine whether your particular brand of anguish qualifies for coverage. The healthcare portal processes your pain with algorithmic efficiency, routing your humanity through automated decision trees where your depression becomes major depressive episode, recurrent, moderate severity. A classification that facilitates billing but bears no resemblance to the actual texture of your sleepless nights or the specific weight that settles over your chest each morning. Corporate structures extend this logic into every dimension of modern life with relentless thoroughness. Your worth is quantified through performance metrics that measure productivity while remaining systematically blind to the human cost of producing it. Social media algorithms judge your value through engagement statistics, reducing the infinite complexity of your personhood to numbers that determine your visibility in digital hierarchies. Even your most private struggles are processed through self-help bureaucracies, evidence-based interventions, step-by-step programs, therapeutic modalities that promise to file your trauma into properly labeled folders where it can be efficiently managed rather than messily experienced, optimized. rather than genuinely healed. Yet observe how your internal landscape has learned this same organizational structure, adopting bureaucratic procedures with the unconscious efficiency of someone who has spent too long working in institutional environments. Your anxiety arrives not as chaotic emotion, but as systematic procedure, the same mental forms filled out each morning as consciousness awakens to inventory its obligations, the same psychological paperwork shuffled from the urgent worry pile to the chronic concern archive. The Department of Catastrophic Imagination opens promptly at dawn, staffing its offices with diligent clerks who process disaster scenarios with methodical thoroughness. The Office of Social Performance maintains meticulous files documenting every awkward silence, every perceived slight, every unreturned message, stamping each incident with the same bureaucratic verdict: insufficient, requires additional processing. Like all bureaucracies, this internal system defends its existence by generating more work for itself with the mathematical precision of institutional self-preservation. The more you worry, the more evidence requires processing. The more evidence processed, the more justification exists for additional worry. You move between windows of thought like an exhausted civil servant, from the Future Disasters Division to the Historical Failures Department, from the Self-Criticism Bureau to the Vague Dread Administration, shuffling the same psychic documents between psychic offices where nothing is ever truly decided, nothing finally resolved. Everything simply circulates through endless corridors of analysis that lead nowhere except back to themselves. But tonight, Kafka offers you the strangest and most liberating recognition when you perceive suffering as bureaucracy rather than personal catastrophe. When you observe your anxiety following predictable administrative protocols, you can begin to relate to these processes not as absolute truths, but as procedural habits performed by systems that have forgotten their original purpose. The clerk denying your application for peace is not malicious, but simply following outdated procedures. The algorithm generating your insomnia is not targeting you specifically, but processing data according to programming that was never designed for human flourishing. Your particular anguish is not unique evidence of individual failure, but part of a larger, almost banal system that processes all human experience with equal mechanical indifference. Visualize now the offices of worry gradually closing for the evening. The fluorescent lights of constant evaluation flicker and dim as the day shift of conscious anxiety clocks out, leaving their paperwork unfinished on desks that will remain exactly where they are tomorrow. The filing cabinets of guilt lock themselves with satisfying clicks, their contents secure but temporarily inaccessible. The Department of Future Catastrophes posts its close sign and turns off its computers. The bureaucracy never truly shuts down. It is too vast, too systematically embedded in the architecture of consciousness. But it can pause, and in that blessed pause, that interval between shifts where no forms require completion and no cases demand immediate processing, there exists a space where sleep becomes possible. You are released from being processed, freed from the obligation to provide documentation for your right to rest, permitted to step out of the institutional building of your own mind and walk into the quiet, unregulated night where no permits are required for the simple, unauthorized act of breathing. The office is closed. Your case is suspended. Sleep is the only authorization you need now. There exists a moment in Franz Kafka's late correspondence when something extraordinary occurs. This man who spent his life documenting the nightmare of existence begins to laugh at his own creations. Friends describe him reading passages from the trial aloud, dissolving into giggles at Joseph K.'s predicament, finding dark comedy in what the world would interpret as pure tragedy. This laughter was not denial, but a more sophisticated form of acceptance. the recognition that when existence refuses to make sense, the appropriate response might be neither despair nor forced optimism, but a kind of cosmic shrug, an acknowledgement that the joke is on all of us and always has been. Tonight, as you lie suspended between exhaustion and insomnia, Kafka extends this same invitation across the decades to stop fighting the chaos and begin floating within it. You have been struggling so heroically to decode the pattern, haven't you? Lying awake, convinced that if you could just think clearly enough, analyze deeply enough, understand thoroughly enough, you would finally crack the code of how to live correctly. You approach existence like an unfinished file in some inaccessible celestial office, shuffled from department to department, never read, never resolved. You torture yourself with the belief that your suffering must have meaning, that your career should follow logical trajectories, that your relationships ought to adhere to cause and effect principles where kindness is rewarded and effort yields results. But what if, and allow this possibility to settle over you like cool cloth on fevered skin, what if there is no equation because the universe was never designed to balance? Kafka's fiction reveals that absurdity is not incidental but foundational to human experience. Gregor Samsa doesn't spend his story searching for the scientific cause of his metamorphosis or seeking magical cures. He simply deals with the immediate, absurd reality of being a beetle. How to crawl under the sofa, what food tastes good now, how to spare his sister the sight of him. There is profound, almost Zen-like acceptance in this practical approach to impossibility. When you recognize that the trial has no legitimate basis, that the castle was never going to grant an audience, that your anxiety arrives precisely because it follows no logical schedule. A strange lightness emerges, freedom born from recognizing you cannot fail at a game that has no winning conditions. Tonight, treat your worries not as serious threats, but as surrealist art. That anxious thought about a conversation 3 years ago? It's merely a melting clock in a Dal painting, vivid but structurally impossible. That fear about future catastrophe? A man in a bowler hat with a green apple floating before his face. Interesting, strange, but requiring no logical response. When you view your concerns through the lens of absurdity, they lose their terrifying authority, becoming mental weather patterns passing through a sky that doesn't care whether it rains or shines. The universe owes you no explanation for its chaos, and more importantly, you owe the universe no understanding. You are permitted to exist in the midst of nonsense without organizing it into coherent narrative. Let the nonsensical thoughts drift by like parade floats, colorful, bizarre, signifying nothing beyond their own strange beauty. There is deep, dark humor in realizing we are all hairless apes clinging to a rock spinning through infinite nothingness, worrying about email etiquette and social status. It's ridiculous. It's laughable. And in that quiet laughter lies the beginning of peace. So embrace the absurdity tonight. The nightmare becomes dream when you stop trying to wake up and simply watch the show. The trial adjourns because the court was made of cardboard. The castle dissolves into mist because it was never solid to begin with. Questions that have tormented you remain unanswered not because you failed to solve them, but because you finally recognize them as symptoms of a deeper misunderstanding, the belief that existence requires justification. Released from the burden of making sense, you can rest in beautiful, meaningless darkness, where sleep arrives not as achievement, but as the natural consequence of finally, mercifully, stopping the exhausting work of thinking itself into coherence. In the final years of his life, as tuberculosis carved hollows into Franz Kafka's lungs and transformed each breath into conscious effort, something extraordinary occurred in the architecture of his imagination. The frantic energy that had propelled Joseph K. through endless corridors of appeal, that had driven the land surveyor toward his eternally receding castle, began to dissipate like morning mist. His late fragments contain characters who simply stop running, who cease their exhausting campaigns against impossible odds and discover in this cessation a strange species of liberation that feels almost sacred in its quietude. Consider Joseph K. In those final moments at the quarry on the outskirts of Prague, led there by his executioners as the city sleeps in blissful ignorance of his fate. He still harbours half-formed hopes that some last-minute explanation will arrive, that a high official will emerge from the shadows to declare the entire proceedings a bureaucratic error. No one comes. The knife descends like a dog, and the sentence is carried out without revelation, without the cosmic vindication he had spent a year desperately seeking. Yet in this apparent defeat lies Kafka's most radical insight. What dies there is not only Joseph K., but the exhausting illusion that justification was ever coming. You have been conducting your own private appeal for years, haven't you? Lying awake, drafting mental briefs in your defense, cross-examining every social interaction for evidence of your inadequacy, presenting arguments to invisible tribunals that never render verdicts. You wage war against your anxiety as if it were a foreign invader rather than weather passing through the landscape of your consciousness. Battle your depression with strategies that exhaust you more than the condition itself. Struggle against the fundamental architecture of your sensitivity as if you could somehow discipline yourself into becoming someone entirely different. Tonight, Kafka whispers across the decades a darker, gentler possibility. The court was never legitimate to begin with. The weapons you have been carrying, the shield of perfectionism, the sword of self-criticism, the heavy armor of constant vigilance, these have wounded you more than any external enemy. Feel them now, these instruments of self-defense that became instruments of self-torture, and allow them to clatter to the floor with the metallic finality of a war finally ended. Surrender, in Kafka's universe, is not collapse but the ultimate act of realism. It is acknowledging that you are small in a vast indifferent cosmos, that you are tired in a relentless world, that you carry wounds that may never fully heal, and that this has always been acceptable. The demand for wholeness was the trap, the insistence on victory was the cage. When you stop arguing with reality about what should have happened, stop cross-examining yourself for crimes that exist only in the courtroom of your imagination, a profound stillness emerges. Let the impossibilities fall away like stones you have carried in your pockets for decades. The confidence you will never naturally possess, the social ease that remains perpetually beyond your reach, the mental stability that others seem to inherit as birthright. These aspirations dissolve not through failure, but through the recognition that they were always mirages, shimmering destinations that receded with each step toward them. The trial adjourns because the defendant has left the building. The castle closes its gates, and you discover the village where you already stand contains everything necessary for this one precious life. Kafka's darkness transforms into a blanket that asks nothing of you except to exist as you are. Beautifully imperfect, necessarily fragile, and finally, mercifully ready to rest in the blessed space where struggle used to live. Now let language itself begin to dissolve like ink dropped into dark water, words losing their sharp edges as they sink toward the silent bottom of consciousness. Return one final time to that narrow Prague apartment where Franz Kafka finally sets down his pen as the candle burns to its last trembling inch of wax. The pages lie scattered across the wooden desk like fallen leaves, each filled with meticulous handwriting that has documented nightmares with the precision of a cartographer mapping territories that exist only in the geography of human suffering. Outside, the city has surrendered to sleep hours ago. Cobblestones glisten with rain that falls so softly it makes no sound. The Vltava River flows dark and silent beneath stone bridges older than memory, and even the gas lamps dim their amber halos in deference to the sacred hour when night reaches its deepest point. Franz rises from his desk, joints stiff from hours of motionless concentration, and moves to the window where his reflection floats ghost-like in the glass, transparent enough that the sleeping city shows through his face as if he were already fading into the landscape he has spent his life describing. The trial has been written, the castle mapped, the metamorphosis documented, the hunger confessed, the burrow sealed, the letter completed, though it will never be sent. Tomorrow there will be the insurance office again, but tomorrow exists in some other country, separated from this moment by the blessed border of sleep. You are here with him now, aren't you? Not in Prague, but in your own version of this room, your own fragment of darkness, where consciousness has finally exhausted its arguments and anxieties grow too tired to maintain their usual vigilance. The machinery of your mind, that relentless bureaucracy of worry, that penal colony of guilt, that fortress of constant analysis, begins to power down with a gentle mechanical sigh of systems finally allowed to rest. Let the characters dissolve first, like sugar in dark tea. Joseph K. fades from the courthouse steps. Gregor Samsa releases his grip on the underside of furniture. K stops his approach toward the unreachable castle. The hunger artist closes his hollow eyes. They drift away not as failures, but as completed stories, their purpose fulfilled in the simple act of being witnessed, understood, and finally released. You no longer need them as narratives demanding interpretation. They remain only as feelings, gentle shapes in the darkness, no sharper than clouds passing before a hidden moon. The thoughts that remain grow longer, slower, less precise. You think trial and the word becomes soft, rounded, almost meaningless. You think castle and it dissolves into distant mist, then into nothing at all. Edges blur. Sentences begin but fail to finish, like staircases that gently disappear into fog. The questions that kept you awake have not been answered, they have simply ceased to be asked. The demands that pressed against your chest have been recognized as fictional, products of systems that forgot their original purpose. Franz extinguishes the candle with moistened fingers, and darkness rushes in to reclaim the room with the gentleness of water filling a space that was always meant to hold it. In this darkness, all distinctions blur. Between waking and sleeping, between self and world, between the weight of existence and the weightlessness of letting go. Your breathing slows to match the rhythm of rain against windows, of rivers flowing through sleeping cities, of the earth itself turning through space with patient, mindless grace. You are released now from the obligation to be anything other than this, breath entering, breath leaving, consciousness dimming like gaslight in the pre-dawn hours. The nightmare of existence transforms into the dream of rest. The burrow grows soft around you. The metamorphosis completes itself in peace. The trial adjourns. The castle closes its gates. There is only this, the soft descent, the gentle surrender, the blessed darkness where you belong entirely to yourself. Sleep. Sleep. Sleep.